Three Jedi Masters sat in a room on a quiet farm world, waiting for a woman to walk through the door. They were the last three alive. They had not come to arrest her. They had not come to help her. They had come to reach inside her and tear out her connection to the Force. Permanently. She would survive it. She would keep walking around afterward, hollow, for the rest of her life. And that was the point. She had not fallen. She had not betrayed anyone. She had fought their war, ended it, and come home on her own to answer for what ending it had cost. That was the problem. She had come home. Hold that image. We are coming back to it. And when we do, you are going to understand why the last surviving leaders of the Jedi Order spent their final free hours planning to mutilate one of their own instead of hiding from the people hunting them to extinction. Because this is not the story you were told. You were told guardians of peace. 1,000 generations. Robes and reason and restraint. All of that is true. It is true the way the surface of an ocean is true. Underneath it, there is another record. And the Order kept that one badly on purpose. It is about the Jedi the Council was afraid of, not the ones who fell. Falling was easy. When a Jedi turned to the dark side, the Order knew exactly what to do. There were procedures. There were teams. There was 1,000 years of precedent stacked behind the decision, and everyone involved slept fine afterward. These are the other ones, the ones who never fell. The ones who fell in a direction nobody had a name for. The ones who did something so far outside what the Order believed was possible that the wisest beings alive looked at each other across that high chamber and understood, without saying it out loud, that they had a problem no lightsaber was going to solve. So they solved it other ways. They unseated a master for seeing the future too clearly. They exiled a teacher because her students had learned to ask questions. They took the most dangerous man in the galaxy, emptied his mind out completely, built a false person in the empty space, and sent that person on a mission without ever telling him he was a fabrication. They found a young woman whose gift could win wars on its own, lied to her about what she was for, spent her like ammunition, and were astonished when she broke. They looked at a 9-year-old boy, correctly identified the exact thing inside him that would one day burn their order to ash, said it out loud to his face, and then did nothing about it for 13 years except watch. Every one of those decisions was defensible. That is what makes this worth 4,000 years of retelling. Half the time the Council saw the danger perfectly, and being right did not save them. The other half, they destroyed someone who might have. They were almost never sure which one they were doing. So here is the question underneath everything tonight, and I want you to carry it with you, because every name in this story is another failed attempt at an answer. What do you do when the most dangerous thing in the room is wearing your own robes? The Order never worked it out. It just kept reaching for the same tool, over and over, for 4,000 years. Tonight, you are going to watch that tool get invented, and you are going to watch it get used on someone who deserved it. And then you are going to watch it travel down the centuries until it is pointed at a woman who deserved nothing of the kind. But she is not where this starts. It starts with the finest Jedi of his generation. Everyone said so. His masters said so. The Council said so. He believed it himself, and that was the beginning of all of it. His name was Ulic Qel-Droma, and the Jedi Order would eventually have to invent a punishment for him, because nothing in its entire history was adequate. Picture the Republic in those days, thousands of years before anyone had heard the name Skywalker. It was smaller than the one you know, and rougher at the edges, And the Jedi were not yet the polished diplomatic order of the later era. They were spread thin across a frontier. They wore what they liked. They took students where they found them, and a great many of them lived and died on worlds the Senate had never bothered to survey. There was no single grand temple with 1,000 years of tradition pressing down on every decision. There were masters and their students, and a loose confederation of trust holding the whole arrangement together. Ulick came out of that world. He and his younger brother Kay were both apprenticed to a master named Arca Jeth, who was one of the great figures of the age, a man whose name still meant something centuries later. Arca Jeth trained them on Arcania, and he trained them hard, and by the time Ulick reached adulthood, he was the sort of Jedi other Jedi looked at and adjusted their own expectations downward. He was a natural. Not in the way people usually mean it, where someone picks things up quickly. Ulick was a natural in the older, more dangerous sense. The Force did not seem to require anything of him. It came when he called, and it did what he asked, and it never once, in his entire youth, made him work for it the way it made everyone else work. Combat, meditation, the subtle disciplines, the crude ones, all of it opened for him, and he was brave. That is the part people forget when they tell the story backward from the ending. Ulick Qel-Droma was not ambitious in any small or grasping way. He genuinely wanted to help. He walked toward danger because someone had to, and he was the most capable person available. And he did it over and over, on world after world, for years. And mostly it worked. His first real test came on Onderon. And if you want to understand everything that happened afterward, you have to understand Onderon. It was a single civilized city on a wild world, walled in against a jungle full of enormous predators, and it had been at war with the exiled descendants of its own criminals for centuries. Beast riders in the wilderness, aristocrats behind the wall, and a hatred between them so old that nobody could remember what had started it. Arca Jeth sent his students to broker peace, and Ulick and Kay walked into a situation that was considerably worse than a border dispute. The royal family of Onderon had been keeping something. Down beneath the palace, in a sealed chamber, lay the body of a man who had been dead for 4 centuries and had never once stopped influencing events. His name was Freeden Nad. He had been a Jedi, and then he had been something else entirely. And the dark side energy soaked into that tomb had been quietly shaping Onderon's politics for generations. The Queen was not merely a tyrant, she was a student. There were Sith holocrons in the palace. There were rituals happening in rooms the Republic had never inspected. Ulick and Kay and their fellow students ended that. It took 2 campaigns, and it took Arca Jeth arriving personally, and at the end of it, Freeden Nad's tomb was moved off Onderon entirely and dropped onto a moon. Sealed and marked and abandoned, which is the kind of solution that sounds permanent right up until the moment it is not. But the point is that Ulick won. He walked into a 400-year-old dark side infestation as a young man, and he came out the other side having broken it. And the Republic noticed, and the Jedi noticed, and Ulick noticed too. It is very difficult to overstate what that does to a person. When you are young and gifted, and every problem you have ever been handed has eventually yielded to you, you do not develop the specific humility that comes from being genuinely and permanently outmatched. You develop something that looks like humility because you are a good person and you have been taught to be modest. But underneath it there is a quiet certainty that has never actually been tested. Ulick had that certainty. and the galaxy was about to test it in a way nobody was ready for, because the Sith were not finished with Onderon, and they were not finished with Ulik. There was a group operating out of the Empress Teta system, a cluster of worlds in the core, wealthy and old and bored. Two aristocrats, Satal and Alima Keto, cousins to each other and heirs to enormous privilege, had gotten hold of a Sith holocron. That was all it took. They founded a society. They gathered other bored, wealthy young people into it, and they began working through the material. They called themselves the Krath, and within a few years they had gone from an occult fashion among the nobility to a movement with an army. They took the entire Empress Teta system in a single night of coordinated massacre. Not a rebellion, not a coup with negotiations. They killed the ruling family at a banquet, and by morning they held 7 worlds. And the Republic, faced with a Sith-aligned power in the core, did what the Republic does. It debated. It formed committees. It requested reports. Ulik did not want to wait for reports. He had a plan. And here is where you begin to see the shape of the man he was and the shape of the disaster he was walking into. Ulik proposed to infiltrate the Krath, not to fight them, to join them, to go in as a convert, work his way to the center of the organization, learn everything, and take it apart from inside. He would embrace the dark side outwardly, convincingly, completely, and he would keep himself anchored by sheer force of will. And when he had what he needed, he would come home. Every Jedi Master he explained this to told him no. Understand that this was not a council of cowards. These were people who had spent their lives walking into dangerous places. Their objection was not that the mission was risky. Their objection was that it was not a mission at all. Because the thing Ulik proposed to do was not a tactic. You cannot use the dark side as a costume. That is not how it works, and it has never once been how it works, and every master in that room had seen enough to know it. The dark side does not care about your intentions. It is not a tool that can be picked up and set down. It is closer to a current. And the only question is how strong a swimmer you are and how long you plan to stay in the water. Ulik proposed to stay in the water for years. They said no. Repeatedly. Formally, he went anyway. And this is the first flinch, the first small moment in this story, where an institution looked at one of its own and understood that it had lost control. Because when Ulik Cheldroma decided that the council's judgment was worth less than his own, the council discovered it had no mechanism to stop him. He was not a child. He was not a criminal. He was the most gifted Jedi of his generation, and he had simply decided he knew better. And there was nothing in the Order's structure, philosophy, or law that could compel a man like that to obey. They could have expelled him. They did not, because he had not done anything wrong yet, and because expelling him would have accomplished nothing except removing the last thread of connection between him and the Order. So they watched him go, and they told each other it would probably be fine. And every single one of them knew it would not be. Ulik went to Empress Teta, and he was extraordinary at it. That is the terrible part. He was so good at pretending to fall that nobody suspected him, and he rose through the Krath faster than anyone had a right to. And he got close to Alima Keto exactly as he had planned. He was gathering intelligence. He was mapping the organization. Every part of the plan was working, except that he was also using the dark side every day, in front of an audience, with total commitment, for months, and he was doing it alone. cut off from anyone who could tell him he was drifting, surrounded exclusively by people who rewarded the drift. Alima poisoned him, slowly, over a long period, with a compound that left him dependent on the Krath's antidote and dependent on the dark side to hold himself together. But if you think the poison is the explanation, you are letting Ulik off too easily, and he would not have wanted that. The poison accelerated something that was already happening. He had been telling himself he was pretending. At some point, without a specific day you could point to, he had stopped pretending. And the only person who could have noticed was him. His friends came for him. That is worth saying plainly, because the Jedi in this story are often the ones doing the cold institutional thing, and here they did not. A group of them went to Empress Teta to bring him home. Among them was a woman named Nomi Sunrider, who we will come back to, and who, at that point, loved him. He fought them. He beat several of them. And when it was over, he was still on Empress Teta, and they were not. Arca-Jeth came for him personally. His own master, the man who had raised him, walked into the heart of Krath territory to bring his student back. Ulik killed him, not in some ambiguous struggle where the blow could be argued about. Arca-Jeth had been captured, was being held in a chamber sustained by machinery, and Ulik tore that machinery apart and let his master die, and then went on with his day. The man who had shaped him, who had taught him every discipline he had ever used, who had trusted him enough to let him become the person he became, gone at his hand, and Ulik did not stop moving. Word of it reached the Order, and something changed in how they talked about him. Before that, he was a Jedi in serious trouble. After it, he was something the Order had to answer for. They put him on trial. Picture that. Coruscant, a chamber full of Jedi and senators, and Ulik Kel Droma, standing in the middle of it in restraints, being formally charged by the institution that had made him. It is one of the very few times in Jedi history that the Order attempted to handle one of its own as a legal matter rather than a spiritual one. And the reason is instructive. They did not know what else to do. He was beyond persuasion. He was too dangerous to release, and the Order had no prisons and no appetite for executions. So they reached for the Republic's machinery because their own had failed. The trial did not finish. A man named Exar Kun came through the ceiling. Kun is a whole story on his own, and not the one we are telling tonight, but you need to know this much. He had been a Jedi too, a brilliant one, a student of the archives who had gone looking for forbidden knowledge and found more of it than anyone expected. By the time he interrupted Ulik's trial, he had made himself Dark Lord of the Sith, and he had come to collect. He and Ulik had already fought once, on Coruscant's underlevels and then on Yavin's fourth moon, and neither had been able to finish the other. What settled it was not the duel, it was a manifestation. The spirit of Marka Ragnos, a Sith Lord dead for millennia, appeared to both of them and declared that they were to stop fighting each other, that Kun would be the Dark Lord and Ulik would be his apprentice, and that together they would finish what the ancient Sith had started. Two men who had spent their lives being told they were exceptional were handed a cosmic confirmation of it by something that seemed to have the authority to give it, and they took the deal. So Kun broke Ulik out of his own trial in front of the assembled Republic. And the war that followed is the one the histories call the Great Sith War. And it burned for years. Ulik led armies. He was very good at that too. The Krath fleets, The Mandalorians who had been brought into the Alliance after Ulick personally defeated their leader in single combat. Whole worlds falling into line. He was not a lurking schemer in a hood. He was a general at the front of his own formations, and the Republic lost battle after battle to a man it had trained. And then, because this story is not permitted to have a merciful shape, they attacked Ossus. Ossus was the great library world. Not a fortress, not a shipyard. Thousands of years of accumulated Jedi knowledge, artifacts, texts, holocrons, the collected memory of the entire tradition, held on a single planet, in a peaceful system, full of scholars. Alima Keto had a weapon by then, a Sith device that pulled matter out of a star, and she aimed it at Ossus's son without fully understanding what she had. The star went unstable. The system began to die, and the Jedi on Ossus abandoned the war and spent their last hours doing the only thing that made sense to them, which was carrying as much as they could carry onto ships before the sky finished failing. Ulick came down to the surface in the middle of that, hunting for artifacts of his own. And his brother Kay found him. Kay Keldroma had never given up on him. Through everything. Through Arca Jeth. Through the trial. Through years of war. Kay had held onto the belief that his brother was still in there somewhere and could be reached. He had lost an arm fighting him once already and replaced it with a mechanical one and come back anyway. On Ossus, he found Ulick in the chaos, and he did not attack. He talked, and Ulick killed him. You can read the accounts, and they all agree on the sequence. Ulick struck him down and then stood there, and something in him that had been buried since Empress Teta came back up through all of it, and he understood exactly what he had just done, and exactly who he had become, and exactly how much of it could not be undone. Nomi Sunrider was standing a few meters away. She had watched it happen. She had loved this man once, had grieved him, had spent years fighting the thing he had turned into. And now she was looking at him standing over his own brother's body, weeping, with no fight left in him at all. She could have killed him. Nobody in the galaxy, Jedi or otherwise, would have said a word. She did something else, and to understand what she did and why it mattered, and why the Jedi Order was never quite comfortable with her afterward, we have to back up and start again with a woman who never wanted any of this. Nomi Sunrider did not grow up in a temple. She was not identified as a child and taken away and raised in the disciplines. She was a young woman married to a Jedi, which is a different thing entirely. And by every account, she was perfectly content with the arrangement. Her husband Andor was the Force user. She was his wife and the mother of a small daughter named Vima, and she had exactly no interest in following him into it. He asked, gently and repeatedly, in the way that people do when they can see something in you that you have decided not to look at. She had the sensitivity. Anyone who spent time around her could feel it. But she had made a decision about the shape of her life, and the decision did not include a lightsaber, and Andor respected it enough not to push. And that was where things stood when they took a job carrying a small case of crystals across the galaxy to a Jedi Master named Thon. They never made the delivery together. On a landing pad on a world called Ambria, thugs working for a Hutt named Bogger came for the cargo, and Andor Sunrider was killed in front of his wife and his daughter in the time it takes to cross a room. What Nomi did next is the reason this story exists. She picked up his lightsaber. She had never held one. She did not know the first thing about how to hold one. And she went through those men, and one of them died. And when it was over, she was standing in the wreckage of her entire life, holding a weapon she did not want. Having done something she had never trained to do, with a level of raw ability she had spent years pretending not to have, then she put the lightsaber down and refused to touch one for a long time afterward. Understand the significance of that. Most of the people in this story are defined by their appetite. They wanted more, they reached further. They went past the line because the line offended them. Nomi Sunrider is the opposite case, and it is exactly why the Order eventually did not know what to make of her. Her defining quality was reluctance. She had killed with the Force, and she had hated it viscerally in her body. And she carried that revulsion with her into everything she ever did afterward. She completed the delivery. She found Master Thon, who was not what she expected in any way, being an enormous four-legged creature with a mind like a library, and she asked him to train her daughter. Thon looked at her and told her that the person who needed training was standing in front of him. She said no. He was patient. That is essentially the entire content of the next stretch of her life. A very stubborn woman and a very old teacher. And eventually the teacher won because he had time and because the galaxy kept providing arguments on his behalf. And when Nomi Sunrider finally stopped resisting, what came out was not what anybody had projected. She was strong in the ordinary ways, but her real gift was something the Order had only rarely seen and never really systematized, and it did not look like power at all when you watched it happen. It was called battle meditation, and describing it makes it sound smaller than it is. Here is what it actually was. Nomi could sit still, in a room, on a ship, nowhere near the fighting, and reach out through the Force across an entire engagement. And on her side of that engagement, people got better. Not metaphorically. Their shots landed. Their formations held under pressure that should have shattered them. Fear that should have broken a line simply did not arrive. Pilots made decisions half a second faster than they had any business making them. And on the other side, the opposite happened. In exactly the same measure, confidence eroded. Orders were doubted. Coordination came apart at the seams for reasons nobody could ever put in a report. One person, sitting quietly with her eyes closed, could take a battle that was mathematically lost and turn it. Now think about that from the perspective of an institution. A great swordsman is a great swordsman. He can be in one place at a time. He can be outnumbered, outmaneuvered, shot from a distance. Every conventional form of power a Jedi could develop had a natural ceiling and a natural counter. And the Order had spent thousands of years growing comfortable inside those limits. It knew what a strong Jedi could do because it had seen thousands of them. Battle meditation had no ceiling that anyone had found. It scaled with the size of the conflict. The bigger the war, the more decisive one woman in a quiet room became. And there was no counter to it except finding her and killing her, which meant that anyone who possessed it was simultaneously the most valuable and the most vulnerable person in any war they touched. The Order used her. Of course it did. Through the entire Great Sith War, Nomi Sunrider was deployed the way you would deploy a fleet. And battles turned because she was present. And the Republic survived engagements it had no right to survive. She was on the front lines constantly, a woman who had wanted none of this and had wept the first time she used the Force to hurt someone, functioning as the single most strategically important individual in the galaxy. And then Ossus happened. and she stood a few meters from the man she had once loved, watching him hold his dead brother. And she did the thing that no one in the Order had ever quite done before. She reached into Ulic Qel-Droma and took the Force away from him, not blocked, not suppressed, not a temporary binding that would wear off when her concentration broke. She severed the connection, permanently and completely. And when it was finished, Ulic Qel-Droma was a man, just a man. He could not feel the Force, could not touch it, could not sense it in the room around him. The thing that had been the fundamental medium of his existence since childhood was simply gone, the way a sense is gone, and it never came back. Read the accounts of what that did to him. He described it as being struck deaf and blind at once, except that the deafness went all the way down into the part of him that had always known where other living things were and what they were feeling. The galaxy went silent. He said it was like standing in an empty room forever. He also said it was the only thing anyone could have done to him that he deserved. Now, here is where we get to why Nomi Sunrider belongs in this story. And it is not the obvious reason. The Order did not punish her, it honored her. She was the hero of Ossus, the woman who had ended the Dark Lord's apprentice without killing him. And within a few years, she was elevated to lead the entire Jedi Order, which she did with distinction. On the surface, nothing about her story is a story of institutional fear at all. But something had changed, and everyone could feel it. Before Ossus, the Order's ultimate sanction against one of its own was death. Ugly, final, but comprehensible, and constrained by every scruple the Jedi had. After Ossus, the Order knew there was another option. You did not have to kill a Jedi who had become a problem. You could take the Force from them and let them keep walking around. And that is a far more frightening power than killing, because it is so much easier to justify. Killing a Jedi requires the Council to conclude that a life must end. Severing only requires the Council to conclude that a person is too dangerous to be trusted with what they are, which is a much lower bar, and a bar that can be quietly lowered further whenever circumstances seem to warrant it. Nobody dies. There is no body. There is no tribunal. There is just a person who used to be extraordinary, walking out of the room ordinary, and an institution that has solved its problem without ever having to admit what it did. Nomi Sunrider had proven it was possible. She had done it once, to a man who had murdered his master and his brother, at the absolute outer edge of what any reasonable person would call justified. And in doing so, she had handed her successors a tool, and the Jedi Order would reach for that tool again. And the next time the person it was aimed at would not deserve it at all. We will get to that. It is the ugliest moment in this entire story. There is a coda to Ulic, and it deserves telling, because it is one of the few places where this history is kind. He went into exile after Ossus, on an ice world at the edge of nothing, and lived there for years as a man with no force and no purpose and no way to make amends. And eventually, a young woman found him, Vima Sunrider, Nomi's daughter, grown now, and frustrated with an order that seemed too busy running itself to actually teach her anything. She asked Ulic Qel-Droma to train her. He told her he could not. He had nothing. He could not even feel the force she was asking him to explain. She told him that was not the same as knowing nothing. And she stayed. And he taught her. And it worked. A man who had been severed from the Force taught one of the finest Jedi of the next generation. because it turned out that the knowledge had never actually been located in the connection. It had been in him the whole time. Nomi came for her daughter, furious, and found the two of them together. And something between the three of them was repaired that had been broken for a very long time. And then, on the way off that world, a man named Hogan shot Ulik Keldroma in the back. Hogan was nobody, a pilot who had figured out who his passenger was and decided that killing the famous Dark Jedi would make him someone. He fired once, and the greatest natural talent of his generation, the man who had led armies and killed his own master and been unmade by a woman who loved him, died on a landing ramp because a stranger wanted a story to tell. There is no lesson in that. It is just how it happened. But hold on to the severing, because it is going to come back. And when it does, the Jedi Order will not be able to hide behind the word justice the way it could at Ossus. Now we move forward, 2,000 years forward, past the collapse of the old Sith Empire and the long, quiet centuries and the slow rebuilding of everything, into an era when the Jedi Order had become the thing you would recognize. A high tower on Coruscant, a council of 12, codified training, a formal Padawan system, a rigorous and increasingly narrow orthodoxy about what a Jedi was and how a Jedi behaved. Institutions calcify. It is what they do. The Order that had been a loose confederation of masters on a rough frontier had become, over 2 millennia, a bureaucracy with a philosophy, and the philosophy had begun to serve the bureaucracy rather than the other way around. And into that order came a woman who asked questions. We do not know the name she was born with. By the end of her life, she had accumulated several and discarded all of them. And the one that history remembers is the one she used when she was already old, already exiled, already something other than what she had begun as. She called herself Kreia. She was a Jedi Master, not a fringe figure, not a maverick lurking at the edges of the Order. She was central. She was one of its most respected historians and one of its most sought-after teachers. And the reason students wanted her was not that she was gentle. She was not gentle. She was famous for being difficult in a way that the Order's more comfortable masters found faintly embarrassing. Her method was simple, and it was corrosive. She refused to let a student accept anything on authority. Not the code, not the council, not her own instruction. If you told Kreia that the dark side was evil, she would ask you to define both words and then take apart your definitions in front of you. If you told her that attachment led to suffering, she would ask you whether the absence of attachment had ever produced anything but a slightly more comfortable kind of suffering. If you told her the Jedi served the Republic, she would ask what the Order would do on the day the Republic asked for something the Order did not want to give. And then she would wait. And the waiting was the worst part. She did not do this to make Sith. She did it because she believed, sincerely and to the end of her life, that a conviction you have not tested is not a conviction. It is a habit wearing a conviction's clothes. And a Jedi operating on habit will fail at the exact moment failure costs the most. Because habits break under pressure, and understanding does not. There is a real argument that she was right. There is a stronger argument that she was right about the diagnosis and catastrophically wrong about the treatment. Both of those things can be true at once, and in her case they very much were. Because here is what happened to her students. They were brilliant. Every account agrees on this. The Jedi who came out of Krea's teaching were sharper, more adaptable, more capable of independent judgment than their peers, and in the ordinary course of things that would have made her the most valuable instructor in the Order. But she taught them to trust their own judgment above the Council's. And then the galaxy handed them a situation where their judgment and the Council's pointed in opposite directions. The Mandalorians came. Not raiders. Not a border problem. A full civilizational war machine rolling in from the Outer Rim, taking world after world, and doing it with a discipline and a joy that the Republic had no framework for understanding. They were not conquering for resources. They were conquering because conquering was the point. Because a culture built entirely around the test of combat needs something to test itself against. And the Republic was the largest available something. Worlds burned. Populations were annihilated or enslaved. The Republic fleet, which had not fought a real war in generations, was pushed back and back and back, and the Jedi Council did nothing. That is the fact around which everything else in this era orbits, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The Council was not indifferent to suffering. They were not cowards. Their reasoning was this: the Mandalorian invasion did not feel like the whole picture. Something about it was wrong. The timing, the coordination, the way the Mandalorians had suddenly unified under a leader nobody could trace. There was a hand behind it that they could sense and could not locate, and every instinct the Order had developed over 1,000 years told them that committing the entire Jedi force to a visible war, while an invisible enemy waited, was precisely how you lose everything. They were right. That is the thing people leave out when they tell this story as a simple failure of nerve. There was a hidden power orchestrating the Mandalorian wars, and it was patient, and it was waiting for exactly the Jedi to expose themselves, and everything the Council feared came true in due course. But being right about the shape of the danger did not make them right about what to do. And it certainly did not answer the question that a generation of young Jedi were asking with increasing volume, which was, how many worlds are we allowed to let burn while we wait for our suspicions to resolve? Krea's students had been taught to ask that question and to distrust an answer that arrived from authority alone. So when a young man named Revan stood up and said he was going to Duro whether the Council approved or not, and asked who was coming with him, hundreds of Jedi went, some of the most gifted of their generation, and a great many of them had passed through Krea's teaching directly or at one remove, because that is how influence works in a small order. The Council watched the largest schism in living memory walk out the door. And then it looked for a cause, and it found her. The formal charge against Krea was not falling to the dark side. She had not fallen. There was no evidence she had fallen, because she had not yet, not for years afterward. The charge was that her teaching had produced the schism, that she had cultivated in her students a disposition toward independent judgment, which had, when tested, expressed itself as mass disobedience. They exiled her for a philosophy. Understand how extraordinary that is, and how much it tells you about what the Order had become. This was a body that had spent thousands of years handling murderers, Dark Lords, mass killers, Jedi who had done unforgivable things in service of the dark side. It had procedures for all of that. And the sanction it reached for against a woman whose crime was pedagogy was expulsion from the Order she had given her life to. Krea's own account of it is worth remembering. She said she was cast out for teaching what she knew. She said it without much heat, as a plain description of events, which is more damning than outrage would have been. Here is the part that makes it genuinely tragic rather than merely unjust. The council was not entirely wrong about the consequences. Her students did leave. Many of them did fall. Revan and Malak went to war and came back as something else. And the war that followed nearly ended the Republic. If you are the sort of person who judges a teaching by what it produces, Kriya's teaching produced a catastrophe, but the council never engaged with the substance of what she taught. They did not argue with her. They did not attempt to demonstrate that she was mistaken about the Order's intellectual complacency, or about the danger of an orthodoxy that had stopped being able to explain itself. They removed her, and having removed her, they treated the question as settled. That is what an institution does when it is frightened of an idea rather than of a person. It does not refute. It excludes, and then it acts as though exclusion were refutation. And an exiled teacher with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose is a considerably more dangerous thing than she was inside the Order, where at least someone was arguing with her. She went into the unknown regions. She went looking for what the Jedi had forbidden her to look for, and she found Malachor. Malachor was a broken world at the end of everything, a planet that had been shattered and had somehow kept its coherence, and buried in the crust of it was an academy the Sith had built and abandoned long ago. The Traeus Academy, a place where the dark side did not merely exist but concentrated, where the very structure of the world seemed designed to strip away whatever a person had brought with them and leave only appetite. She learned there. She took a name there, Darth Traia, the Lord of Betrayal. And she took students of her own. And if you want to know what a woman who has been cast out for teaching does with a second chance at teaching, the answer is that she chose two of the most damaged beings in the galaxy and made them into weapons. And then they betrayed her. Of course they did. She had named herself for it. Her own apprentices, a man who could not die and a man who consumed the living, decided that their teacher had grown weak in her convictions, and they stripped her of her title and her connection and cast her out into the ruin of Malachor to survive, or not. Twice. Exiled. First by the Jedi for teaching, then by the Sith for the same crime, in a different accent. Nobody in galactic history has been thrown out of more institutions for the offense of refusing to stop asking. And what she concluded from all of it is the single most alarming idea any Force user has ever had, more radical than anything the Sith produced in 5,000 years of trying, and the reason her name belongs in this story above almost anyone else's. She decided the Force was the problem, not the dark side. Not the Sith, not the Jedi, the Force itself. The thing every tradition in the galaxy had agreed was the fundamental good, the medium of life, the will that bound existence together. Kriya looked at the entire history of it and concluded that it was not a benevolent presence at all. It was a hand on the scales. It had a design, and it moved beings toward that design. And every war and every fall and every prophesied chosen one was the Force arranging its pieces. And the beings involved had never once been genuinely free. She wanted to kill it, not defeat the Jedi, not restore the Sith. She wanted to end the Force as a phenomenon, everywhere, permanently, and hand the galaxy back to itself. And she believed the price of that, an entire species of Force users losing everything they were, was worth paying for the freedom of every being who came afterward. Now consider the Jedi Council of her era. 12 people in a chamber, dealing with a war they could not win and a hidden enemy they could not find. Holding an institution together on the strength of a tradition they had mostly stopped examining. They exiled a woman for asking uncomfortable questions. They had no idea. The question she went away and worked out, alone in the dark, at the end of the galaxy, was one that no Sith Lord in history had ever had the nerve to ask. That is what happens when you exclude instead of argue. You do not stop the idea. You just stop being in the room where it develops. She would come back eventually, and she would find one last student, and that student is the reason we can tell this story at all. But before we get there, we have to deal with the man who walked out the door and took hundreds of Jedi with him, and with what the Council eventually did to him, which remains the most disturbing single act in the recorded history of the Jedi Order. Revan. The full story of that life is long enough to fill a night on its own, and we have told it elsewhere. So tonight we are going to stand in one specific room and look at one specific decision. Here is what you need going in. Revan went to the Mandalorian Wars against the Council's explicit instruction. Revan won them, which no one else had managed, or looked likely to manage. Revan then vanished into the unknown regions, chasing the hidden power everyone had sensed, found it, and came back as a dark Lord of the Sith at the head of a fleet, and spent the following years trying to conquer the Republic he had just saved. And then the Republic caught him. A strike team boarded his flagship in the middle of a battle. His own apprentice, Malak, seeing an opportunity, fired on the ship with Revan still aboard. And when the smoke cleared, the most dangerous person in the galaxy was lying in the wreckage of his own bridge, alive, catastrophically injured, and unconscious. They brought him to the Jedi. Now put yourself in that chamber. You are a Jedi Master. In front of you, unconscious, is a man who has killed millions, who has broken the Republic's fleet, who has burned worlds, and who is, by a considerable margin, the most capable strategic mind anyone has encountered in 1,000 years. He will wake up. When he wakes up, he will be exactly who he was. What do? You cannot imprison him. There is no facility in existence that will hold that man for a month, let alone a lifetime. And everyone in the room knows it. You cannot execute him. That is not who the Jedi are. And beyond that, there is a war on, and Revan is the only person alive who knows where the enemy's power actually comes from, where the shipyards are, what the hidden empire in the unknown regions is planning. Killing him kills the only map. You cannot redeem him by ordinary means. You do not have years. You have days. And so the Council did a third thing. And it is the reason Revan belongs in this story, rather than merely in a story about Sith Lords. They reached into his mind and took it out. Not his memories in the sense of forgetting. They dismantled the person. Everything Revan had been, his history, his convictions, his relationships, his name, the entire accumulated architecture of a life, removed. And then they built something in the empty space. A false identity, a background, a career, a personality, an ordinary Republic soldier with an ordinary past, seamless enough that the man himself never once suspected during all the months he lived inside it. And then they set that constructed person loose on a mission designed to lead him by a route he would believe he had chosen, back to the source of his own power so that they could use his instincts to find what his knowledge would not give up. Read that again slowly, because the horror of it is easy to skate over when it is dressed up in the language of galactic necessity. The Jedi Order did not kill the most dangerous man alive. It deleted him and wore him. They will tell you it was mercy, and there is a version of the argument that holds together. He was alive. He got a second life. And in that second life, he did enormous good. And by the end of it, he had chosen the light freely, which is more than most fallen Sith are ever offered. Set against execution, it looks generous. But notice the shape it shares with what Nomi Sunrider did at Ossus. And notice how far the shape has traveled in 2,000 years. Nomi severed a man's connection to the Force in the moment after he murdered his own brother, out of grief, standing over a body, with no time to deliberate and no institution behind her. The council that remade Revan did it in a committee room. They deliberated, they planned, they assigned personnel. Somebody in that process was responsible for designing the false childhood, and somebody else reviewed the design and suggested improvements to make it more convincing. This was project work. And the justification was not that Revan had done something unforgivable, though he certainly had. The justification was that he was useful. That is the line the Jedi Order crossed and never really came back from. Not the day they fought a Sith Lord. The day they decided a person could be dismantled and rebuilt as an instrument because the instrument was needed, and told themselves that the alternative was worse, and were probably even right about that, and did it anyway. There was one more thing they did, and it is the detail that turns an appalling decision into something almost unbearable. They needed the reconstruction to hold. A mind that has been rebuilt that thoroughly is unstable. And there was a young Jedi whose Force bond with Revan had been formed in the moment of his capture, and was, they realized, the thing keeping him alive. So they used her. They placed her at his side without telling her the whole truth, and they let a bond that was holding a lie together deepen into something neither of them had consented to, and they watched. Her name was Bastila Shan. And what the Order did to her is its own story. And it starts, as these things so often do, with a gift she never asked for. Battle meditation had not appeared in the Order for a very long time. It is not a discipline you can teach. There is no exercise that produces it. It arrives in a person or it does not. And across the entire span of Jedi history, you can count the confirmed practitioners on your hands. Nomi Sunrider had it. And 2,000 years later, in a Padawan barely out of her teens, it surfaced again. The Order's reaction tells you everything. They did not treat it as a talent to be developed carefully over a lifetime. They treated it as an asset that had come online during wartime. Bastila Shan was young. She was arrogant in the specific brittle way of people who have been told they are important before they have done anything. And she was almost immediately deployed into fleet actions where the outcome of the entire war rested on whether one very frightened young woman could hold her concentration. She held it. That is the astonishing part, and the part that gets lost. Engagements that should have been routes became narrow victories. Republic officers began requesting her presence before major operations, not as a Jedi advisor, but as a piece of ordnance. There are surviving fleet reports that discuss her availability in the same register they use for capital ships. And the Sith noticed, because of course they did. And the calculation on their side was simple. One person was keeping the Republic in the war. Remove her, and the Republic collapses on schedule. So Bastila Shan spent her early 20s as the single highest priority target in the galaxy, sent repeatedly into the most dangerous places available by an order that needed what she could do more than it could afford to protect her. Then they gave her Revan. She did not know. That is the thing to hold on to. When the council placed her alongside the reconstructed man and told her to keep him close and report on his development, they did not tell her that the bond between them was load-bearing, that the mind next to hers was an artificial one, or that the entire arrangement was a council fabrication in which she was a component. They told her enough to make her useful and nothing that would let her make an informed choice. She fell in love with him. Naturally. She was young. The bond was real, even if its origin was not. And nobody had warned her what proximity to a mind like that would do. And when Malak finally captured her and put her in front of the machinery and told her the truth about who her companion actually was, and used the fact that she had been lied to by her own order as the wedge to open her, it worked. Bastila Shan fell to the dark side. And for a period, the most powerful battle meditation in the galaxy was pointed at the Republic instead of at its enemies, and the Republic began to lose in exactly the way the Sith had calculated. She came back. She was pulled back, in the end, by the same bond the Council had engineered for entirely different purposes, which is either an irony or a judgment depending on your temperament. But look at what the Order actually did here. Because it is subtler than the mind wipe, and in some ways it says more. They found a young woman with a rare and enormous gift. They did not ask what she wanted. They did not slow down. They did not build the relationships that would have let her carry the weight, or tell her the truth about the situation they had put her in, or accept that a person who is a strategic asset is still a person with a claim on honesty. They used her in the plain sense of the word. And when the using produced exactly the breakdown that anyone might have predicted, the Order's reaction was to be surprised. The Council was afraid of Bastila, not of her character, which was never in serious doubt, but of the raw arithmetic of what she represented. A single individual whose loyalty determined the outcome of a galactic war. That is not a person an institution can be relaxed about. Every conversation the Council had about her was, underneath, a conversation about contingency. And there is no version of that conversation that does not eventually arrive at the question of what happens if she cannot be recovered. They never had to answer it. She came home, but they had already learned the answer somewhere else. And they had already used it. And the person they used it on had done nothing to deserve it at all. Which brings us, finally, to the ugliest thing in this half of the story. There was a Jedi who followed Revan to the Mandalorian Wars. She was one of the ones who stood up when he asked. She was a general, and, by all accounts, an unusually good one. Not because of raw power, but because people would follow her into anything. That was her actual gift, though nobody understood it at the time, including her. She formed bonds, deep ones, permanent ones, with everyone around her, and those bonds made the people near her stronger and braver and more capable than they had any right to be. Her name was Meetra Surik. The war ended at a world called Malachor. The Mandalorian fleet had been drawn there deliberately into a trap that Revan had spent the entire campaign constructing. And at the center of that trap was a device, the Mass Shadow Generator. What it did, in essence, was reach into the gravity of a world and pull, and everything within reach came down. Meetra Surik gave the order to activate it. The Mandalorian fleet died. So did the Republic fleet in the same volume. Because there was no way to build a trap that discriminating, and everyone involved had known that going in. Tens of thousands of people on both sides, many of them her own soldiers, many of them her own friends, crushed and torn apart in a single moment while she stood there and felt every one of them die through the bonds she had spent years forming. The Force did not merely hurt her, it broke against her. What happened next has no precedent anywhere in the record. Mitra Surik, in the instant of that death, severed herself from the Force, not a decision made over time. A reflex, the way a hand pulls back from a fire, except that the thing she pulled back from was the fundamental medium of existence. And she did it so completely that afterward, she could not find her way back in. She survived Malachor as the only Jedi in history to be cut off from the Force by her own reaction to grief. And then she did the thing that makes her, in my view, the most genuinely admirable person in this entire story. She went home. Revan did not. Malak did not. The others who had followed him scattered, or went with him into the unknown regions, or simply disappeared. Mitra Surik came back to Coruscant, alone, with no Force and no allies and no excuse prepared, and stood in front of the Jedi Council to answer for what she had done. She was the only one who did, and the Council exiled her. The reasoning, insofar as it was ever articulated, was not that she had killed her own soldiers. It was that she was wrong. That what had happened to her at Malachor was a wound in the Force. That she was that wound walking around. And that the Order did not know what she was or what she might do or what might be following her. She frightened them at a level below argument. She stood in that chamber as a hole where a Jedi should be. And 12 of the wisest beings alive looked at her and could not think of a single thing to do except make her someone else's problem. Take her lightsaber, strike her name, send her out now. That is bad. But it is not yet the ugliest part. And the ugliest part comes years later, because she survived the exile. She wandered the outer rim for a decade, and then something began pulling her back toward the center of things, and along the way, something impossible started happening. The connection began to return, not restored by anyone. She was regrowing it through exactly the mechanism that had cost her in the first place, by forming bonds with the people around her. She was rebuilding her relationship with the Force out of other beings. Nobody had ever done that. Nobody had ever needed to. And the surviving Jedi Masters, scattered and hiding by then, hunted almost to extinction by a new generation of Sith, learned that she was coming back and that she was growing stronger, and they gathered on Dantooine to meet her. This is the room I opened with. Understand that these were the last of them. 3 masters, effectively the remnant of the entire Order, and they had come out of hiding for the first time in years, at enormous risk. For this, they did not come to help her. They gathered to sever her connection to the Force, permanently. The way Nomi Sunrider had severed Ulic Qel-Droma 2,000 years before, over the body of the brother he had murdered. Mitra Surik had murdered no one that her Order had not ordered her to kill. She had ended a war that was consuming the galaxy. She had come home voluntarily to face judgment when no one else had the courage to. She had spent 10 years in exile without complaint. And she had committed the offense of surviving something the Jedi Council could not categorize, and of healing from it in a way their philosophy did not have room for. For that, the last 3 masters of the Jedi Order agreed among themselves that the correct course of action was to reach into her and take away everything she had rebuilt. That is the tool Ossus put in their hands. Look how far it traveled, and look what it was pointed at by the end. Not at a Dark Lord's apprentice standing over a corpse, at a woman who had done what they asked and come home to explain herself. They did not manage it. Kriya was there, and Kriya had been waiting a very long time for exactly this, and she killed all three of them in that room. You are allowed to have complicated feelings about that. I certainly do. The woman who was exiled for teaching walked into the chamber where her order was about to commit its final act of institutional fear, and ended the Jedi Council with her hands, and did it partly out of loyalty to her student and partly for reasons entirely her own that would not become clear for a long time. But she was not wrong about what was happening in that room. The Jedi Order in this era was not evil. I want to be very clear about that, because it would be easy to hear this half of the story and conclude that the Council was a collection of frightened bureaucrats destroying anyone who unsettled them. Some of them were. Most of them were people trying to hold together something ancient and precious in the middle of a catastrophe, making decisions with insufficient information and no good options, and paying for those decisions with their lives more often than not. But every single time this order encountered a Jedi, it could not fit into its existing categories. Its first instinct was containment, not curiosity, not learning, containment. Exile the teacher, rebuild the general, deploy the girl, sever the survivor. And every one of those decisions cost them something they could not afford. And by the end of it, there were 3 masters left alive on a farm world, and they died reaching for the same tool one more time. That is where the old Republic leaves us. But the Order rebuilt, as it always did. Centuries passed, and then 1,000 years, and the Jedi became something grander and more secure and considerably more certain of itself than it had ever been in these rough early days. A great tower on Coruscant, a council whose word was not questioned, a tradition so long and so unbroken that the possibility of being wrong about anything fundamental had quietly stopped being discussed. And into that order, in its final generations, came a man who saw the future and would not stop saying so. A man sent into the darkness on the Council's own orders and distrusted forever after for going too willingly. A lineage of swordsmen whose greatest master had built a form that ate his own students. A boy from a desert world who was given a seat on the Council and denied the rank in the same breath by 12 people who all knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. They were afraid of him from the day he walked in. They said so, out loud, in the room, while he stood there and listened. We will get to what that did to him. A Jedi Master walked into the council chamber and told them the Republic was about to fall. He was right. He had the shape of it correct. The war, the scale, the timing, close enough that acting on it would have changed everything. He said it clearly. He said it more than once. He would not let it go. So they took his seat away. He died a few years later on a jungle world, alone, on a mission that was arranged for him, and the secret he had been keeping sat undiscovered for a decade until the day it marched out of the sea on Camino, and the Jedi took command of it without ever asking where it had come from. That is how the Order ended. Not with a betrayal. With a warning it decided was a symptom, because there is a version of this story that treats the fall as a sudden thing. A single terrible night, an order given, the tower burning, 1,000 generations gone in a few hours. That version is comforting, because it puts the disaster outside the Order. Something was done to them. Nobody could have seen it. The conspiracy was real. It was extraordinary. Hold on to that, because it is true. But the Jedi were warned from inside by their own people in language that was not remotely ambiguous. And every single time, the institution did the thing it had been doing for 2,000 years. It contained the warning. It did not act on it. 4 people are going to frighten the Council in this half of the story, in 4 completely different ways, and none of them will be a Sith. One of them saw the future. One of them was ordered into the dark and blamed for arriving. One of them built a weapon out of his own darkness and taught it to his students and watched what it did to them and kept teaching it. And one of them was a boy the Council was afraid of from the moment he walked through the door. And every single fear they had about him turned out to be correct. And that is precisely why they lost. We begin with the man who saw it coming. His name was Sifo Dyas, and he was, for a period, one of the most respected masters of his generation. That is worth establishing immediately, because he has come down through history as a footnote and a mystery, a name attached to a strange transaction, and that framing does a disservice to who he actually was. Before any of it started, he sat on the Jedi Council. He was regarded as gifted, thoughtful, and orthodox. He had a long friendship with another rising master of the era, a Sereno aristocrat named Dooku, and the two of them talked the way friends do about the state of the galaxy and where it was heading. And then Sifo Dyas began to see things. Precognition was not unusual among the Jedi. Almost every Force user experiences some version of it, a sense of danger before the shot, a knowledge that a person is about to walk through a door. What Sifo Dyas experienced was categorically different. He saw the future in structured, sustained, coherent visions. And what he saw was war, not a war. War as an approaching condition. He saw the Republic torn in half. He saw fleets burning above worlds that had been at peace for a millennium. He saw the Jedi Order thrown into a conflict it was not built for and could not survive intact. And he saw it not as a possibility among possibilities, but as a thing already in motion, close enough to touch, arriving whether anyone prepared for it or not. He brought it to the Council. Now, understand the position the Council was in when he did. The Republic was in the longest period of continuous peace in its recorded history. There was no standing army, and that was not an oversight. It was the central political achievement of the age, the thing generations of senators had built deliberately, the proof that a civilization could organize itself around negotiation instead of force. The idea of raising an army was not merely impractical. It was, to the people in that chamber, a kind of blasphemy against everything the Republic had made of itself. And here was a master saying that the peace was ending and that the Republic needed soldiers. They heard him out. And they concluded that Sifo Dyas was being deceived by his own gift. That conclusion was not stupid. It was, in fact, extremely well grounded in Jedi doctrine. And every master in that room could have cited the reasoning without preparation. Visions of the future are notoriously unreliable. They show possibilities, not certainties. They are shaped by the fears of the person receiving them. And a Jedi who acts decisively on a vision frequently causes the very outcome he was trying to prevent. There is a long and painful history behind that teaching. Jedi had burned worlds trying to avert prophecies. More than that, The dark side clouds and distorts prophecy specifically. A Jedi consumed by visions of catastrophe is a Jedi being worked on by something, and the appropriate response is not to build an army. It is to help him. So they told him he was mistaken. And when he would not stop, when he kept coming back with more detail and more urgency and more insistence that the galaxy was running out of time, they removed him from the Jedi Council. Say that plainly and let it sit. The Jedi Order took one of its most gifted seers, a man whose only offense was refusing to be quiet about what he saw, and stripped him of his seat. They did not expel him. He remained a Jedi in good standing, and he was given assignments, and life went on. But the message had been delivered with total clarity, and the message was that his warning was not merely rejected but disqualifying, that the act of continuing to warn was itself the evidence of his unfitness. And so, a Jedi Master, with an accurate vision of an approaching catastrophe, found himself outside the room where decisions were made, with no institutional path to doing anything about it, and with an absolute conviction that billions of people were going to die if he did nothing. What would you do? He went around them. Sifo Dyas made contact with the cloners of Kamino. Quietly, on his own authority, representing himself as acting for the Republic, he placed the largest single military order in galactic history, an army. Grown, trained, purpose-built, delivered on a timeline that would have it ready at roughly the moment his vision said it would be needed. He funded it through channels that have never been fully traced. He told almost no one, and he did it, believing, entirely sincerely, that he was saving the Republic from an institution too committed to its own ideals to see what was coming. You can call that arrogance. It is arrogance. It is also exactly the same arrogance that made Ulic Qel-Droma walk into the Krath against the Council's explicit order 2,000 years earlier. And the parallel is not accidental. It is the specific failure mode of a very gifted person inside an institution that will not listen. When the order says no, and the world says the order is wrong, some people accept the discipline, and some people conclude that the discipline has forfeited its claim. The Jedi never solved that problem. They never even developed a vocabulary for it. And here is the part that turns a story about institutional stubbornness into something much darker. Sifo Dyas was not alone in his thinking. He had a friend he had been talking to about all of this for years. A friend who agreed with him about the coming war, who encouraged his conviction, who may well have helped shape the vision itself. Dooku knew. And Dooku, by that point, was not only Dooku. The army Sifo Dyas ordered in secret to save the Republic was an army that the enemy of the Republic knew about from the first day. It was modified. Something was built into those clones at the genetic level, a directive they would carry without knowing it. And it would sit dormant in every one of them for a decade until a single phrase activated it. And Sifo Dyas himself did not survive to see any of it. He was sent on a mission, and his ship came down. For 10 years, the Jedi Order did not know that an army had been commissioned in its name. The record had been altered. Kamino itself had been removed from the archives, a deletion that could only have been performed by someone with the deepest possible access to the temple. And when a Jedi finally stumbled across those clones, the Order did not investigate the discrepancy. There was a war starting. There was an army available. They took it, and they marched at the head of it. And they never once seriously interrogated where it had come from until it was far too late to matter. That is the shape of the whole tragedy in one sequence. A master saw the truth. The council decided the truth was a symptom and removed the man who carried it. Removed from the institution, he acted alone. And acting alone, he was manipulated by the very enemy his visions had been trying to warn everyone about. And the institution then inherited the poisoned result of its own refusal to listen, and used it, and died of it. If the council had engaged with Sifo Dyas instead of unseating him, they would have had a decade of warning. They would have investigated the Kaminoan contract in the open with the full resources of the Order, at a point when the conspiracy was still young and fragile. Everything might have been different. They were afraid of what he was saying. So they made him someone who spoke from outside. They would do it again, in a different register, with a man whose gift was not to see the future, but to touch the past. His name was Quinlan Vos. And if you want a single individual who embodies everything unresolved about the Jedi Order in its final century, he is the one. He came from Kifu, and his people had an inherited ability that most of the galaxy had never heard of: psychometry. Quinlan Vos could put his hand on an object and read what had happened around it. Not vaguely. He could touch a wall in a room where a murder had occurred and experience the murder, the intention behind it, the identity of the person holding the weapon. He could pick up a discarded tool and know the hands that had used it. As an investigative gift, it was without equal. The Order deployed him as something close to a detective, and he worked the parts of the galaxy that other Jedi did not go to: the underworld, the trafficking routes, the places where the Republic's writ was theoretical. But there was a cost built into the gift, and it was not incidental. To read an object properly, Quinlan Vos had to open himself to whatever was in it, and what he spent his professional life touching was atrocity: murder weapons, torture rooms, slave holds. He absorbed the interior experience of the worst people in the galaxy over and over as a job for years. And every single time he did it, he had to let that experience run through him without resistance, because resistance meant a partial reading, and a partial reading meant a case he could not close. Nobody had ever built a discipline for that, because nobody in the Order had ever needed one. He was improvising the boundaries of his own mind as he went, and then he lost his memory. That is a long story of its own, involving an operation gone wrong and a chemical designed for exactly that purpose. But the outcome is what matters. Quinlan Vos woke up on a hostile world with no idea who he was, no training he could consciously access, and instincts that had been shaped by a decade of swimming in other people's violence. He rebuilt himself from the outside in, over a long and ugly period. And the man who came back to the Order afterward was not quite the man who had left. He was harder. He was more comfortable in the dark. He had learned to survive by methods the Order did not teach and would not have approved of. And he had discovered that he was good at them. The Council could see it. Everyone could see it. And what they did about it is the most remarkable decision in this entire section, because it is a perfect and unconscious inversion of something the Order had done 2,000 years before. They sent him undercover into the enemy's inner circle. Stop and appreciate what has just happened across 2,000 years of institutional memory. Ulik Keldroma proposed to infiltrate a dark side organization by outwardly embracing the dark side. And every master he asked told him no. And their reasoning was that the dark side cannot be worn as a costume, that no one is a strong enough swimmer to stay in that current indefinitely, that the plan was not a tactic, but a category error. They told him it was impossible in principle. He went anyway, and he proved them right in the most catastrophic way available. And the Order paid for it with the library world of Ossus and a generation of its best people. And now the Jedi Council, in full session, looked at a man whose grip on himself was visibly compromised and ordered him to do that exact thing. They did not have amnesia. The Great Sith War was in the archives. Every master in that room could have recited the Kel Droma affair. They simply believed, as institutions in decline always believe, that the rule had been made for other people in other conditions and that the present emergency was different. And to be fair to them, they were desperate. The Clone Wars were on. The Order was hemorrhaging masters at a rate it had never sustained before. Dooku's network was invisible to them, and Quinlan Vos was the only asset they had who could plausibly get inside it, precisely because the darkness in him was real enough to pass. That is the trap. The qualification for the mission was the thing that made the mission lethal to him. So Quinlan Vos went to Dooku, and he played the role of a Jedi ready to turn. And he was extremely convincing. He was convincing because it was not entirely a role. Dooku was not a fool and could not have been fooled by a performance. What got Vos through the door was that there was a genuine part of him that wanted what Dooku was offering, and he let that part do the talking. The Council knew this. Not all of them, but Yoda knew, and Mace Windu knew, and they made a calculation. They accepted a level of genuine corruption in one of their own as an operational cost, and they authorized it in advance, and they did not tell the rest of the Order. Then it got worse, in the way these things always do. Somewhere in there, Vos crossed over. Not entirely, and not permanently, but he did things for Dooku that were not theater. He killed for him. He served as Sith Lord with something closer to loyalty than to pretense, for a period. And he came back from that. But he came back having actually done those things, and the Council could no longer tell what he was. That is the fear. And it is a genuinely novel one in this story. With every previous figure, the Order's problem was that it could see something and could not categorize it. With Quinlan Vos, the Order's problem was that it had deliberately created a person whose true allegiance was unknowable, including to himself, and then had to keep using him because he was the only source they had. Yoda kept him close. Mace Windu never trusted him again and did not pretend otherwise. And for the remainder of the war, one of the Order's most capable operatives functioned in a permanent gray zone, doing necessary work, watched constantly, unable to prove his loyalty because the whole point of his cover was that his loyalty looked compromised. He survived it. He survived the end of the Order too, which very few did. And he spent the dark years afterward doing exactly what he had always done, moving through the underworld, gathering what could be gathered, keeping people alive. But the thing worth taking from Quinlan Vos is not his personal outcome. It is what the Council was willing to do by the end. An institution that had once refused to let a Jedi walk into the dark for good reasons had become an institution that assigned Jedi to walk into the dark as policy, and then feared them for having gone. The Order manufactured its own untrustworthy people, and then treated their untrustworthiness as a personal failing. That pattern was not confined to covert operations. It had worked its way into the most respected corner of the Order, into a discipline invented by the man who sat at the very center of the Council, and it had been quietly eating that discipline's practitioners for years. We need to talk about a form of lightsaber combat. Bear with me, because this sounds like a technical digression, and it is not. It is the clearest example in the entire history of the Order of the Jedi being frightened of something and doing nothing about it because of who had made it. Lightsaber combat had been formalized over thousands of years into a set of traditions, each with its own philosophy, its own strengths, its own characteristic failures. The most aggressive of them was the seventh, and the seventh had a reputation. It was ferocious, it was unpredictable, it was devastating, and it was regarded with deep suspicion by the Order because of what it did to the person using it. To fight in the seventh form properly, you had to reach for a kind of controlled fury. Practitioners were monitored. A number of the Jedi who fell over the centuries had been students of it. And then Mace Windu built something new on top of it. He called it Varpad, after a creature from a volcanic world whose limbs moved so fast that observers could not count them and could not predict them. That is the surface of it, the speed and the unreadability, and that is the part people mean when they say Mace Windu was the finest swordsman in the Order. But the name was about something else, and Mace was explicit about it, to the very few people he taught. Varpad did not merely permit the user's inner darkness. It required it. The entire mechanism of the form was to open yourself to your own capacity for rage and violence and enjoyment of combat, and to open yourself simultaneously to your opponents, and to become a conduit through which both of those currents flowed. You did not suppress the darkness. You did not resist it. You used it as the medium of the fight, the way a swimmer uses water. And you won by riding a current your opponent was drowning in. Mace Windu understood exactly what he had made. He described it, in his own words, as a path that led very close to the dark side, and that most Jedi should never attempt. He was not naive about it for a moment. He taught it anyway. Now, why did the Council permit this? Because here is a master of the Order, sitting on the Council, having personally invented a combat discipline whose operating principle is the deliberate cultivation of the dark side inside a Jedi and teaching it to other Jedi. And the institution that had exiled Kreia for asking difficult questions did not intervene. The answer is that he was Mace Windu. He was the second most senior member of the Order. He had the Shatterpoint sense, an ability so rare that nobody else in the Order possessed it, which let him look at a situation and see the single flaw where pressure would break it. His judgment had been correct in crisis after crisis for decades. If Mace Windu said he could hold this, the Council's institutional instinct was to accept it, because the alternative was a confrontation nobody wanted to have with the one man everybody relied on. And that instinct is precisely what the Order's whole philosophy was supposed to guard against. Nobody's control is permanent. That is the entire content of the teaching. It applies to masters. It applies especially to masters. The Order knew this in the abstract and could not apply it to a colleague. Only 3 Jedi ever truly mastered Varpad. Look at what happened to the 2 who were not Mace Windu. Sora Bulk was a Weequay master, a friend of Mace's and a genuine collaborator in the development of the form. He was not a marginal figure. He was regarded as one of the finest blades in the Order, and he helped build the thing. He fell to the dark side and joined Dooku, completely, without visible struggle, and he became one of the most dangerous of the Separatist Dark Jedi. And Jedi died at his hands, not corrupted slowly over decades by an outside influence, He had spent years practicing a discipline that required him to enjoy his own violence, and eventually he stopped seeing a reason to only enjoy it inside the lines. Deepa Bilaba is the one that should have ended the argument permanently. She was Mace Windu's own Padawan. He had raised her. She sat on the Jedi Council in her own right. And by every account, she was among the most balanced and thoughtful masters of her generation. A genuinely serene person. The last individual anyone would have flagged as a risk. He taught her Vapad, and she mastered it. And she was fine for years. Then the war sent her to Harun Kal, Mace's own homeworld, a jungle planet in the middle of a vicious insurgency. Her mission was to organize the local militia and train them into an effective fighting force. And out there, cut off, surrounded by a war, with no clean sides, and no supply lines, and no council to report to, something in her started to slip. She began by adapting to the conditions. Then she began winning by the local rules, which were atrocious. Then she stopped being able to distinguish between what the mission required and what the jungle required. And by the time anyone at the temple understood what was happening, the Jedi Master they had sent to civilize a guerrilla war had become the most feared guerrilla leader on the planet. Mace Windu went to bring her back personally. His own student, what he found was not a Jedi who had fallen in the ordinary way. She had not sworn any oath or taken any title. She had simply, over months, run out of reasons not to do the next terrible thing. And Vapad had given her the tool to do all of it while feeling capable and clear and entirely in control. That is the specific horror of the form. It does not feel like falling. It feels like mastery. The confrontation between them broke her. She survived it. But what came back from Harun Kal was not who had gone out, and she spent a long time afterward in a state from which recovery was uncertain. So, 3 masters of Vapad. One fell outright and served a Sith Lord. One was destroyed by it in the field, and the third was the man who invented it, sitting on the council, still teaching it, still insisting that it could be held. And the Order did nothing. There was no review. There was no prohibition. Nobody stood up in that chamber and said that a discipline with that failure rate needed to be ended. Why not? Because by that point, the Order needed Mace Windu more than it needed to be right. There was a war on. He was winning battles. The most senior masters were dying at a rate that made every remaining one indispensable, and a council that had once exiled a teacher for the disposition her students displayed could not bring itself to question a colleague whose students kept turning into dark Jedi. That is what fear looks like when it points inward at power the institution depends on. It does not produce a confrontation. It produces silence. Before we get to the last of them, there is one more case. And it is different from every other story in this collection. And I include it because without it, the ending does not make sense. Everyone else here frightened the council because of what they could do. This one frightened them because of what was being said about them. Ahsoka Tano was a Togruta Padawan, assigned to the most difficult master in the Order at an age when most Padawans were still being kept away from front lines. She was extremely good, not the strongest Jedi of her generation. And I am not going to pretend otherwise, because the interesting thing about her has nothing to do with raw power. She was good in the way that matters operationally. She learned fast. She held up under conditions that broke adults, and she had a moral instinct that was over and over across the war, more reliable than her masters. By the late stages of the Clone Wars, she was a commander with real responsibility and a war record that many knights could not match. Then somebody bombed the Jedi Temple. Not the Separatists, not an outside attack, an explosion in the temple hangar, an act of terrorism against the Jedi Order carried out from inside, and a Republic investigation immediately and publicly underway, at a moment when the Order's standing with the Senate and with the public was already deteriorating badly. The Jedi had spent 3 years as generals in a war they had originally opposed, and the goodwill was gone, and the Senate was looking for reasons. Evidence was manufactured pointing at Ahsoka Tano. Well manufactured by someone with intimate knowledge of the temple. And, to be fair to everyone involved, it was convincing. Here is what the Jedi Council did. They expelled her from the Order. And having expelled her, they handed her over to the Republic military for court-martial on a charge that carried a death sentence. They did not conduct their own inquiry first. They did not exercise the Order's ancient right to try its own. They did not slow the process down by a single day. And slowing it down was entirely within their power. And every one of them knew it. The reasoning, which Mace Windu articulated in the chamber, was that the Order could not be seen to protect its own from Republic justice in the middle of a political crisis. Which is true. It is a genuine consideration, and it was a genuinely dangerous moment for the Order's position. But strip the language away and look at the transaction. A 16-year-old girl who had fought for them for 3 years was handed to a military tribunal to protect the institution's relationship with the Senate. They were not afraid of Ahsoka Tano. They were afraid of the Senate and of the Holonews, and of the erosion of a status they had held for 1,000 years and could feel slipping. And when an institution is afraid of that particular thing, the person it sacrifices is always whoever is easiest to sacrifice. Which means it is always someone young and someone without a seat in the room. She was exonerated. Barely. And late. And only because her master went out and found the actual culprit while the trial was running. The truth came out in a courtroom rather than from any Jedi investigation. Because there had not been a Jedi investigation. And then the Council did the thing that finished it. They welcomed her back. They apologized, after a fashion. And they told her that the whole ordeal had been a trial, a test of her faith, the Force presenting her with a great challenge. And by enduring it, she had proven herself ready for knighthood. That is not an apology. That is an institution taking its own catastrophic failure of nerve and relabeling it as a spiritual exercise it had administered on purpose. They did not say, "We were wrong." They said this was always the plan and you passed. She looked at them and she left. Nobody does that. In 1,000 years of records, there is barely a case of a Jedi at the height of their promise, simply walking out of the temple, not fallen, not expelled, not in disgrace, just finished. She handed back her lightsaber and went down the steps and did not come back. And Anakin Skywalker watched her go. Understand what that did. This was the person he had raised. The Order had taken her, condemned her without inquiry, nearly executed her, and then asked her to be grateful for the lesson. And the council he sat on, without the rank of master, had voted for all of it. Every doubt he had ever had about whether the Jedi Order actually cared for its people had just been confirmed in front of him with the institution's full formal authority. They would come to him a few months later and ask him to spy on his oldest friend for them, and be surprised when he hesitated. So keep that in view as we turn. Finally, to the young man everyone in that room had been afraid of since the day he was brought in front of them. As a child, you know the name, everyone knows the name. And that is precisely the problem with telling this part of the story. Because the ending is so enormous that it swallows everything before it. And people work backward from the mask and assume the whole thing was inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was decided in a series of specific choices by specific people in a specific room. And the first of those choices was made in front of a 9-year-old boy who had been free for about a week. Picture the testing chamber. High above Coruscant, in the tower, 12 of the most accomplished Force users alive, arranged in a circle. In the middle, a child from a desert world who until very recently had been someone's property, standing alone, being examined. They probed him. They ran the standard assessments. And then they kept going. Because the standard assessments were returning numbers that did not make sense. His connection to the Force was not merely strong for a child. It was stronger than anything ever formally recorded in the history of the Order, including every master in that room, including Yoda. And then they told him what they had found in him. They told him he was afraid. Yoda said it plainly. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And they asked the child what he was afraid of. And the child, being 9 and honest, told them the truth. He was afraid for his mother, who was still a slave, who he had left behind, who he could not stop thinking about. He was correct to be afraid. She was in danger. She was, in fact, going to die badly, and he was going to be there when it happened. But the council did not hear a boy accurately assessing his mother's situation. They heard attachment, which was the specific fault their entire philosophy was constructed to prevent, presenting in the most powerful Force-sensitive any of them had ever encountered. So they refused him. Too old to begin the training. He would not be a Jedi. Now, I want to be careful here, because it is very easy to make this a story about a callous council destroying a child's dream. And that is not quite what happened. Their reasoning was sound. It was, in fact, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 generations. And it was correct in every particular. Children were taken as infants for a reason. A boy who arrives at 9 has already formed the deepest bonds a person forms. He has a mother he loves. He has memories of a home, and the Jedi path requires a relationship with attachment that a 9-year-old with a living mother in slavery cannot possibly have and cannot be taught to have on any reasonable timescale. They were right. That is what makes it a tragedy rather than a crime. But look at what they actually did with the correct diagnosis. Because this is the pattern of the entire night, and it reaches its perfect expression here. They identified a danger. They named it out loud in front of the person it lived in. And then they did nothing about the cause of it. Not one master in that chamber suggested going to Tatooine and buying Shmi Skywalker's freedom. Nobody proposed it. It would have cost the Order approximately nothing. They had resources. They had ships in the system already. The single most Force-sensitive being ever discovered was standing in front of them, terrified for one specific person. And the fix was a transaction, and it did not occur to anyone to make it, because slavery on the Outer Rim was a political matter outside the Order's remit, and because addressing the fear directly was not how the Order had ever handled fear. The Jedi way was to teach a Jedi to release attachment. not to remove the thing they were attached to from danger. So the fear stayed exactly where it was. And then Qui-Gon Jinn died, and everything changed, but not in the direction of wisdom, because the council reversed itself. Not because they had resolved their objection. Their objection was untouched. They reversed because a dying master's last request had been made in front of witnesses, because a newly minted knight was going to train the boy with or without permission, and because a Sith Lord had just appeared on Naboo after 1,000 years of absence. And suddenly, a prophecy about a chosen one who would bring balance seemed considerably less academic than it had the previous week. They admitted him while remaining afraid of him. That is the entire architecture of the disaster, established in the first year, and it never changed. And, having admitted him, they handed him to the least experienced master in the Order. Obi-Wan Kenobi was, by any reasonable assessment, a superb Jedi. That is not the issue. The issue is that he had been a Padawan himself, a matter of days earlier, that he had never trained anyone, that he was grieving his own master, and that he had privately shared the council's doubts about the boy from the beginning. The most difficult student in 1,000 years was given to a first-time teacher who was not sure the student should be there. Any of the great masters could have taken him. Yoda could have taken him. Mace Windu could have taken him. Instead, the Order let the assignment be settled by a deathbed promise and a young man's stubbornness. And then it stepped back. And for 10 years, nobody in that chamber seriously revisited the arrangement. Meanwhile, on Tatooine, his mother was still a slave. 10 years. He knew where she was. He had the ability to go and get her at any point after the first year or two. And he did not, because the Order forbade it, and because he was trying very hard to be what they wanted. He dreamed about her. He told people he dreamed about her. And the guidance he received consistently from the institution and from his master was that dreams pass and attachment is the path to the dark side, and he should let it go. She was being tortured to death while they told him that. When he finally went, he was too late by hours. She died in his arms. And Anakin Skywalker, at 19, having done everything the Order asked of him for a decade, having let it go the way they told him to, discovered that letting go had cost him the only thing he had ever asked them for. Then he killed everyone in that camp. Not the warriors. Everyone. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. And that tells you more about the Order's final years than any battle. He told someone. He confessed it entirely, in detail, that same night, to Padme Amidala. He never told the Jedi, not his master, not the council, not anyone in the Order who had spent 10 years shaping him. The institution responsible for his moral development had made itself the last place he would ever bring a moral catastrophe, because he knew with total certainty what the response would be. Not help, judgment, and confirmation of everything they had said about him in that chamber when he was 9. So the Order took the single most dangerous man in the galaxy, and by the age of 19, it had trained him to hide. And then it made him a general. The Clone Wars turned Anakin Skywalker into the most famous Jedi alive. The hero with no fear, which is a title of some irony given the conversation in the testing chamber. He won impossible engagements. He saved fleets. He became the public face of the Order at the exact moment the Order's public standing began to matter enormously. The Council used all of it. They deployed him constantly into the worst places because he delivered. They gave him a Padawan, in part as a discipline, hoping the responsibility would teach him what a decade of instruction had not. They relied on him, and they still did not trust him. Both things, simultaneously, for years, which brings us to the moment that has no parallel anywhere in Jedi history. They gave him a seat on the Jedi Council and refused him the rank of Master. There is no precedent for that. None. The seat and the rank had never been separated in the entire recorded history of the Order, because they could not be. The Council is a body of masters. That is what it is. To place a knight in a council chair is to create a category that does not exist and had never needed to exist. And they did it in front of him, in the chamber, without warning. Understand what that communicated. Because it was not ambiguous, and it was not accidental. The Order was saying, in the most formal setting available, "We require your presence. We do not endorse your judgment. You will sit here, and you will hear everything, and you will not be one of us." He reacted badly. Of course, he reacted badly. He was proud. He had earned more decorations than anyone his age in history, and he had just been publicly told that his achievements did not amount to the thing he had wanted since he was 9. But strip out his reaction entirely and look only at the Council's decision. And it is still one of the worst decisions any institution has ever made about a person, because they were not finished. Having installed him in a seat they had explicitly declined to say he deserved, they immediately asked him to do the single most trust-dependent thing they had ever asked of any Jedi. They asked him to spy on the Supreme Chancellor, to report on the private conversations of the one person in the galaxy who had been kind to him without conditions since he was a child. Read those two decisions next to each other. We do not trust you enough to make you a master. Now go and be our informant inside the office of the head of state, using a personal relationship we have never approved of, and bring us what you hear. Anakin said out loud that they were asking him to do something against the Jedi Code. He was right. Nobody in the chamber engaged with that. And it is the same move, exactly, that the Order made with Bastila Shan 4,000 years earlier. Identify a person whose gift makes them uniquely useful. Decline to give them the full truth or the full standing. Place them in a position of enormous psychological pressure because the institution's needs require it, and then be astonished when the pressure does what pressure does. The Order had made this precise mistake before, in the same form, and it had cost them the war, and it was in the archives, and they walked into it again. The last act, you know, he brought them the truth. That is the part people forget when they tell it as a simple fall. When Anakin Skywalker finally understood who Palpatine was, he did not go to the Sith Lord. He went to Mace Windu immediately and told him, and handed over the single most important piece of intelligence in 1,000 years. And Mace Windu told him to stay in the council chamber. At the decisive moment, having been given everything by the man they had spent 13 years not trusting, the Order's response was to leave him behind and go without him. Sit with that. He did the right thing. He did the difficult, loyal, correct thing at enormous personal cost. And the institution's reaction was to exclude him from the room where the consequences would play out, because it still did not consider him reliable. He was alone in that chamber with nothing to do but think. For the length of time it takes to lose your nerve, while the fate of the only two people he loved was decided somewhere else without him. We know what he did next, and it damned him. And nothing about the Order's failures makes it less his own. But here is the thing I want you to take away, because it is the whole point of this half of the story. The Jedi Council was right about Anakin Skywalker. From the very first day, in the testing chamber, they looked at a 9-year-old and correctly identified the exact quality that would eventually destroy them. Their perception was extraordinary. Their diagnosis was flawless. And being right did not save them, because they never once treated the diagnosis as a problem to be solved. They treated it as a risk to be monitored. For 13 years, every institutional decision they made about him flowed from fear rather than from the responsibility that fear should have created. They named his attachment and left his mother in chains. They doubted his temperament and gave him the least experienced teacher available. They needed his power and withheld the recognition that would have cost them nothing. They distrusted his loyalty and then demanded he prove it in the most compromising way imaginable. Every one of those choices was defensible on its own terms. Together, they built a person who had nowhere to go. That is what an institution does when it is afraid of someone it cannot do without. It watches. It hedges. It keeps the person close and keeps them outside at the same time. And it tells itself that vigilance is the same thing as action. The Order died of that, not of a betrayal. Of 13 years of vigilance where there should have been care. So let us end somewhere else, with the only person in this entire story who had the chance to do it differently, and who did, and who found out that the other road has its own price. The Jedi were gone for a generation. The tower was emptied. The archives were burned or taken, and everything the Order had accumulated over 1,000 generations was reduced to one old man in a desert and another in a swamp and a handful of survivors hiding under other names. And then a farm boy rebuilt it from almost nothing. Luke Skywalker had no counsel. That is the fact underneath everything that happened next. He had no body of masters to consult, no accumulated precedent, no chamber of 12 to share the weight of a decision. He had fragments of instruction from 2 teachers who had both died on him, a handful of recovered texts, and an academy full of students. He was not qualified to teach because nobody alive was qualified to teach them. He set it up on the 4th moon of Yavin, in an ancient temple complex, which was a decision made for practical reasons, and turned out to be the worst possible choice available in the galaxy, because Exar Kun was still there, 4,000 years earlier. At the end of the Great Sith War, the Jedi had come to Yavin to finish the Dark Lord, and Kun had performed a ritual that tore his spirit out of his body before they could destroy him. His body burned with the rest of the moon's surface. His spirit stayed, bound to those temples, conscious and patient, and entirely without anything to do for 4 millennia. And then, a school full of untrained Force sensitives moved in on top of him. He went looking for the most promising one, and he found a young man named Kip Duron. Kip's history mattered enormously to what happened, and it is worth laying out. His family had been political dissidents under the Empire, which meant that as a small child he had been sent with his parents to the spice mines of Kessel, which was as close to a death sentence as the Empire issued without the paperwork. He grew up there, not visited, not imprisoned briefly. He grew up in the mines, in the dark, doing labor that killed adults. And his older brother had been taken separately, conscripted into the Imperial Military Academy on Carida, which meant that somewhere out in the galaxy, Kype had a brother wearing the uniform of the people who had put him underground. He was pulled out of Kessel eventually and brought to Luke's academy, and he was immediately identified as the strongest student there by a wide margin, not incrementally stronger. Kype Durron's raw potential was in the range that the Old Order would have flagged as a matter for the Council on the first day. So you have an enormously gifted young man carrying a childhood of genuine atrocity and a specific, entirely justified rage at an institution that still existed and still had ships and was still killing people. And you have a 4,000-year-old Sith Lord with nothing but time whispering to him. It was not a difficult job. Kype Durron took a weapon called the Sun Crusher. It was a small ship built around a single capability. And the capability was this: it could fire a resonance torpedo into a star and cause that star to go supernova immediately, killing every living thing in the system. He used it, the Carida system first, an Imperial Academy world, a legitimate military target by any reading, and also a populated system. And the star went, and everything around it went with it. Millions of people. And among them, in the academy where the Empire had sent him, his own brother, who Kype did not know was still alive until it was far too late to matter. He killed his own brother. The same note that ended Ulic Qel-Droma 4,000 years earlier, on a dying library world. The story keeps arriving at the same place, and Kype did not stop there. He went on, system by system, and the death toll climbed into a range that has no useful comparison. Luke went to stop him, and Kype Durron struck Luke Skywalker down. Not metaphorically. He hit him with everything Exar Kun had given him and left the last surviving Jedi Master unconscious and dying. His body kept alive by machines, while whatever was left of him drifted somewhere the doctors could not reach. The students of the Academy eventually broke Exar Kun's hold together, which is its own story. Luke came back. Kip came back too, the hold on him broken, and he understood precisely what he had done. And he turned the Sun Crusher into a gas giant's core and went to Luke to be judged. Now, put yourself in Luke Skywalker's position, because it is the same position the Council was in with Revan and with Mitra Surik and with Ulic Qel-Droma standing over his brother. In front of you is a young man who has killed millions of people. He was manipulated, genuinely and thoroughly, by an ancient Sith Lord that you brought him into contact with through your own error in choosing that moon. He is the most powerful student you have, and he is completely, visibly, unbearably remorseful. The New Republic wanted him. There were governments demanding a trial, and they had every legal and moral right to demand it. And the deaths were not in dispute. Every precedent in Jedi history pointed one direction: exile him, sever him, hand him over, contain the danger, and demonstrate to the galaxy that the Jedi police their own. Luke did none of it. He took responsibility for the whole thing personally, argued that the fault lay with the teacher who had put an untrained student in a temple full of dark side residue, refused to hand him over, and kept him at the academy. Kyp Durron was not punished. He was, in effect, forgiven and told to spend the rest of his life earning it. That decision was ferociously controversial, and it should have been. There were people at that academy who could not accept it. There were governments that never forgave it. And you can construct a completely coherent argument that Luke Skywalker, faced with the greatest single act of mass murder committed by a Jedi in 4,000 years, chose the interests of the Order over the claims of the dead. But he had watched what the old Order did. He had read what remained of the archives. He had seen an institution that met every uncategorizable person with containment and had ended up with 3 masters on a farm world and, later, with nothing at all. And he made a deliberate decision to build something that responded to catastrophe with responsibility instead of exclusion. So, did it work? Partly. Genuinely, partly. And I want to be fair, in both directions. Kyp Durron became one of the finest Jedi of the New Age. He became a master. He trained others. When the galaxy faced an invasion from outside itself, an enemy that could not be sensed in the Force at all, he was among the most effective commanders the Jedi had, and the number of lives he saved over the following decades is not small. And he was also, permanently, a problem. Because a man who has been forgiven, that has learned something about his own judgment, and what he learned is that when he is certain and the leadership is hesitant, he is entitled to act. He led his own squadron on his own initiative. He made strategic decisions that committed the entire Order to positions Luke had not agreed to. During the invasion, he repeatedly forced Luke's hand, escalating conflicts and creating situations where the Jedi had no choice but to follow him in. And the New Order came close to splitting over it more than once. He was Ulic Qel-Droma's problem, wearing better clothes. The gifted man who has decided that his own judgment outranks the institution's, operating inside an institution that has no mechanism to compel him and no willingness to build one. Luke Skywalker feared Kyp Durron. Not the way the old council feared Anakin, in a chamber, in silence. Luke feared him openly and told him so, and argued with him, and kept him close anyway, and never once reached for exile or severing or any of the tools his predecessors had used. And that, in the end, is the only real answer this story has. Look at what we have covered tonight. A young man told he could not walk into the dark, who went anyway, and lost his master and his brother, and his connection to the Force. A woman who never wanted the power she had, who invented the cruelest sanction in Jedi history out of love, and handed it to everyone who came after her. A teacher exiled for teaching, who went away and came back with the most radical idea anyone has ever had about the Force. A general dismantled and rebuilt as a tool because he was useful. A young woman deployed like ordnance and lied to by the people she trusted. A survivor who came home voluntarily to answer for what she had done and was cast out for the crime of not fitting a category. A seer unseated for seeing. An investigator ordered into the dark and distrusted for arriving. A swordsman whose greatest creation ate 2 of the 3 people who ever mastered it. Protected by an institution that needed him. A boy who was correctly diagnosed at 9 and never once treated. And a mass murderer who was forgiven and became a master and never stopped being dangerous. 4,000 years. Different eras, different councils, different galaxies almost. And underneath every single one of those stories is the same institutional reflex. appearing over and over with the reliability of a physical law. When the Jedi Order encountered power it could not categorize, it reached for containment before it reached for understanding. Exile the teacher, unseat the seer, sever the survivor, rebuild the general, deploy the girl, watch the boy. Never, at any point in 4,000 years, sit down with the person and ask what they actually needed. Because asking would mean admitting that the code as written did not have an answer, and an institution that admits that once has to admit it forever. And the thing that makes this genuinely tragic rather than merely damning is that the Order was so often right. Right about Ulick. Right about the dark side not being wearable. Right about Anakin's attachment. From the very first day, with a precision that is frightening to read. The Jedi were not fools and they were not villains. They perceived correctly and then they acted out of fear. And perception without courage is just an accurate record of your own destruction. Every institution has this in it. Every one. The Jedi Order simply had 4,000 years and a galaxy to demonstrate it on, and better records than most. So when you hear that the Council feared certain Jedi, understand what that actually meant. It did not mean the Council thought they might lose a fight. Yoda was never worried about losing a fight. It meant that these were people the Order could not fold back into itself. People whose existence was an argument the Code could not answer. And an institution built entirely on the premise that it already has. The answers cannot survive. An unanswerable question standing in front of it, wearing the same robes. They feared them because they could not explain them. And in the end, the thing they could not explain walked into that chamber one last time. And everything the Order had built over 1,000 generations went out with the lights. Sleep well,